At this time, we're going to switch gears and we're going to transition into our panel discussion. But before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to first just take a moment and remember our honorary panelist, Mr. Kent Healy of West Tisbury, who sadly passed away late last year. During our initial planning for this event, he had agreed to join us as a speaker and a panelist. And we wanted to leave a chair for him at our virtual table in honor of his memory. For those in our audience who may not have known him, Kent dedicated much of his life to the stewardship of our island water resources as a civil engineer, as the town sewer, and later as a selectman for the town of West Tisbury. His careful attention to detail and meticulous collection and recording of environmental data throughout many of the ponds and watersheds of the vineyard helped to form the baseline for much of the knowledge and the understanding that we possess today. Our ability to meet the challenges that face our island is built on the foundation that he and other community leaders like him have created for us. And as a special treat and to honor Kent's unending voice at our table, Ollie Becker of the Martha's Vineyard Film Festival has put together a brief clip for us from an interview that he conducted with Kent early last year as part of his upcoming documentary featuring the Great Ponds of Martha's Vineyard. In this clip, Kent shares just a small fraction of his immense wisdom and experience surrounding our ponds. And I'm going to play that for you guys right now.
Well, first of all, because I'm an engineer, I'm interested in the physical aspects of the world. And so I love to study things, the growth of trees, or the building of houses, or ponds, or rain, or wind, or so on. I've done a lot with wind, for instance. That's my line of work. As I tell people, how do I like being a selectman? I say, well, I'm the wind, rain, and gravity guy. Other people could deal with the politics, but I'm the wind, rain, gravity. So for that reason, I'm interested in the ponds. The one thing that I tell people and is that Tisbury Great Pond is just a drainage. It just drains the rain that falls on the pond out into the ocean. We get about 4 feet of rain every year. Only about 1.5 feet of that actually soaks into the ground. It only soaks into the ground during the winter months because now the rain that falls is used by the trees. And it's only between about November and May that the rain that falls actually soaks and is absorbed into the ground. So if you want to know what's going on, you have to measure the rainfall. And if you're worried about the groundwater, you have to sample the rain on a regular basis and see what's in it. People around the pond with their houses worry about erosion of the banks and water in their basements and so forth. It's interesting because there are a lot of houses being built now around the pond, particularly one on Manda's Point. I frequently get calls from architects who were designing these houses. How high is the pond going to be? How high does it get? So what I tell them is, well, I have a little graph here which I give to people. I said, I don't know how high the pond is going to be next year, but if you look at the reoccurrence intervals, that is every so many years the pond will be a certain elevation, about every 5 years it gets up to +7. Then in 1991, Hurricane Bob got up to +9. And then in 1938, you don't remember the hurricane in 1938, do you? I do. The pond elevation was at +12. And they say, well, are you sure about that? I said, I don't know when it's going to be at +12, but it will be sometime in the future. I don't know what year. So design your house around it. So they don't. They just hope for the best. Because people are becoming more concerned about it, I say, well, you have to measure things. You have to keep track of things. So you want to know what's going on, measure the rainfall, measure the flow in the brooks. There's 2 brooks going into the pond. Measure the elevation of the pond. Measure the groundwater. Keep track of stuff so you'll know what's going on. The pond is only there because it rains, you know, and so There's now a Millbrook Management Committee, as you may be familiar with that.
Yep.
I said, that's good, because the Millbrook is there because the rain falls on a certain area of land. If it didn't rain, the Millbrook would not be there. So if you want to know what's going on, measure the rain. Keep track of it. I measure the rain in 4 different places here. It's not always the same. You know, there's one down there, there's one up there, there's one around there. It varies. So when people say they measured the rainfall to 1/100th of an inch, I said, yeah, yeah, maybe. And people will say, gee, it rained a lot yesterday. I said, a lot is not a number. You have to keep track of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Kent will be missed. Very important point. You got to keep track of stuff. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. So again, I'd like to thank Ollie for putting that clip together. And we're all looking forward to seeing your upcoming documentary. Now, to begin, I'm going to switch over to Guy. Okay. We are going to begin our panel session, and I'm going to start by, again, thanking all of our panelists and speakers for joining us today for this session, for this workshop. We really appreciate all your time and effort. And I'm going to start with just going around the table here and having everybody introduce themselves. So thank you again and welcome. Feel free to turn your cameras and turn your microphones on. So I'll just ask you to each please introduce yourself and just provide a brief description of your career and the roles that you play associated with pond management or with just management on the island in general. And we'll start with, how about Mr. Bill Wilcox? Why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Dave. I'm Bill Wilcox, a former water resource planner at the Martha's Vineyard Commission. I have a geology degree from the University of Mass and an advanced geology degree from Columbia University. And for about the past, well, I guess it was about 35 years, I worked on and off on water resource issues.
Yeah, you've definitely been around the circuit a few times, Bill, in your day.
And it shows.
All right, why don't we move on? Joan, why don't you introduce yourself for us?
So my name is Joan Malkin. I live in Chilmark. I don't have the credentials, I don't think, that everyone else has. I was, back when I got paid for what I did, I was a lawyer, but not in any field, even marginally related to ponds or the environment. But I guess I have some newfound expertise. Years ago, I accepted the position of Chilmark Pond president, association president. And it was so long ago that when I think about what we used to do with the pond, it's so different than what is now done with the ponds. But that was my introduction to pond management. I subsequently went on the Chilmark Conservation Commission, and I'm still on that. And I am also on the, I am currently the chair of the Martha's Vineyard Commission. So in that capacity, I'm also participating actively in the Climate Action Task Force with Liz and others. So I'm really kind of a jack of all trades, but my overarching interest is in preserving the island and all of its natural resources.
You say you don't have the specific qualifications, but I don't know what I just heard just sounded exactly.
Wait till you hear my answers to the questions.
All right, I'm excited. Why don't we we already know, we've already met Liz, but Liz, why don't you go ahead and just in case anyone's just tuning in, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and just let us know your role and how you got into the business, I guess.
Well, I'm so excited to be the first climate change planner for the Martha's Vineyard Commission. I was the conservation agent in the town of Oak Bluffs for 26 years before that. I do not have a degree in science. I have a degree in American history, and I'm a big fan of the liberal arts education. And I think that history is very important as we're looking at climate change, because we need to look at things like the land use traditions of the Wampanoag tribes and how that way they used the land and cared for it can help us as we look to the future.
That's great, thank you. And lastly, but not least, Great Pond Foundation's Scientific Program Director, Julie Pringle. Why don't you go ahead and just quickly introduce yourself?
Great. Hi, I'm Julie. I actually grew up on the island. I'm from Vineyard Haven. I went on to study biology and then oceanography, and somehow ended up back on Martha's Vineyard. And I've been working for Great Pond Foundation since 2019, I believe. So I run the ecosystem monitoring program, which is a bit more than what I talked about in that talk. It's the water quality monitoring program, but also biodiversity monitoring. We do eelgrass surveys. We keep track of the cyanobacteria levels and other initiatives related to water quality.
Great. Well, glad to have you here. All right. So I'm going to start us all off with one of our prepared questions. And this is just to all the panelists. I'll choose one of you guys to start. But over the course of your careers and your long history here on the island, your roles associated in the realm of pond management or just island management, have you observed any impacts from climate change? Can you say that you've seen an impact from climate change? And we had kind of chatted a bit about this yesterday, but Bill, why don't you start off?
Sure. I think deciding what the cause of an observable parameter is a very difficult thing. But I think two things that have happened over my time period being familiar with the ponds are the rise of the dermo parasite in oysters, which is enhanced by warmer water temperatures, and also the rise in the green crab population, which is once again favored by warmer water temperatures. So I think those two are good possibilities for being stimulated by the change in the climate.
Well, that's great. Joan, do you have any thoughts on that same question?
I do, but I also agree with Bill that it's risky to assume that any change that you see is attributable to climate change. Two things come to mind. When we first moved here 40 some odd years ago, there used to be crabs, lots and lots and lots of crabs at the canal between the upper and lower Chilmark Pond. You know, it was a great pastime for kids. Well, there aren't any. We had one bizarre summer a few years ago when there were several. But for whatever reason, whether it's attributable to climate change or you know, additional development and nutrification, they're not there anymore. And the second thing that's very, very obvious to me where I live is that the pond depth is, we're losing pond depth. And it's particularly the case probably where I am. We used to be able to sail with a boat with a centerboard. You can practically walk across the pond near where I live. And it's a result of storms, migrating barrier beach and storms just flooding the sand over into the ponds. And without any form of dredging, it creates way higher temperatures in the pond and a lot of other things that I'm not scientific enough to be able to classify. But yes, I do see changes over time. I would be hesitant to say they're caused by climate change.
And it's almost that, again, we get back to that point of that, you know, the predicted impacts of climate change are exacerbating that dune erosion, that retreat of the dune, the filling in, the losing of depth and things like that. I
mean, I imagine that if we had monitored each of these things over those 40 years, we would probably have a much better idea as to the cause.
Right.
But for a long time, you know, we were mere observers on the pond.
Thanks, Joan. Liz, in your time as the conservation agent, your long history here on the island, could you say that you've seen any significant changes that could be related to climate change or possibly even exacerbated?
Well, yeah, I'll echo Bill and Joan's comments that we can't declare that something is definitively related or entirely related to climate change. I walk the Oak Bluff shoreline a lot, almost every day. And over the last few years, I've watched the salt marsh and farm pond deteriorate. And that may well be because of the circulation issue. It may well be because of higher tides and sea level rise, but it's very disturbing. When I walk on East Chop Drive across from Crystal Lake, you can see the water creeping up towards the road there, and that road's at serious risk of breaching at some point. I've noticed, less eelgrass when I'm scalloping in the ponds, and absolutely heavier rainfall, and more storms and more flooding. The coastal roads seem to flood all the time now, even in rainstorms that aren't necessarily related to coastal nor'easters and such.
All good points. And I'll go lastly, Julie, in your time here on the island, have you noticed any changes that caught your eye?
Yeah, it's difficult to document these changes quantitatively. Certainly there are changes that are occurring, but as others have said, it's almost impossible at this point to blame climate change for what's happening, although climate change will undoubtedly have an impact in the future. It's just right now, you can't blame it exclusively. Certainly there are trends. So we tend to see more record temperatures, for instance, although it's not really cut and dry. So a couple of years ago, we had the hottest July that at least Great Pond Foundation has recorded, but the following August was a lot cooler than normal. So, and then what is normal? So it's hard to compare, and it's hard to say it is definitely climate change, but on a larger scale, certainly, I know that this is something that scientists are studying, and the Northwest Atlantic, so around the northeast of the United States, is changing at a really rapid rate. And I know that there are documented changes in temperature and pH and changes in weather that will be occurring, and all of these will certainly eventually have an impact.
I've noticed in all of your responses that a common thread was, what is normal? What is, it's without that data from say 30, 40, 50 years ago, how can you compare rapid changes that are happening today? And it just it underlines that importance of the recording of the data. Let's see here.
So I think some of us have more thoughts on the topic. I don't know if you can see our little.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see the little, okay, yeah, it
Yeah.
reordered itself quickly and I'm just like immune. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's, who put their hand up first? Sorry.
I think it was Liz.
Okay, Liz, why don't you chime in then?
Yeah, hi, I just had one more thought on that. As a summer kid, a long time ago, I can remember wearing jeans and taking sweaters with me when I went out at night in August. And I haven't worn jeans or a sweater in the summertime in decades. Just an observation.
That's a good one. Even I feel like I've noticed that. Joan, why don't you go ahead first? With your point.
So it did occur to me, I think that there's a lot more Phragmites than there used to be. And while you fringing the ponds, it's either good for the ponds or not, I'm not quite sure, as Liz pointed out, but the increase in Phragmites is made possible by environmental changes. And then we get to the question, well, are those environmental changes driven by eutrophication or climate change and the salinity of the water. But so again, it's not possible to make it accountable to something, but I do think that that is a change over time, which is certainly impacting our ponds.
Bill, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, a couple of things. One, in response to Joan's memory about crab populations, the blue crab larvae recruit into the coastal ponds from offshore. And I believe, if I remember right, that's during the summer. And so if there isn't a summertime opening in the pond, the larvae can't get into the system and mature into the crab population. A good reason for consistent summertime openings, in addition to control nutrients, is to allow the coming and going of the different populations that reside in the pond. And the other one, if I could, was someone raised a question about nitrogen content in the rainfall. The Millbrook Watershed Committee back in 2015 did collect rainwater samples that were sent off for analysis, and they came back with less nitrogen than was considered to be the likely contribution. And it was my recollection is it was about a third less than was expected. Mm-hmm. And the other thing with the rain, the acid rain, the rainfall falling on the upland, especially during the growing season, a good deal of that nitrogen is incorporated into the nitrogen cycle. The rainfall that falls directly on the pond is certainly a substantial contribution.
Those are all very good points. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to add? Great. I'm going to move on to another question here. I'm going to direct this one to both Joan and Liz. And what data do you find most useful when you're making planning or any kind of management decisions? You know, in both your roles, the MVC, which is very much a planning island-wide management organization. Are there different types of data and focusing on ponds that you find most useful in making those decisions? And maybe we'll go with Joan first, if you feel like it.
I'm happy to take it and say I don't have the answer to that. I was very cool because I was so incredibly informed by Julie's presentation, which to me provides a very, very definitive answer. And as I said before, the kind of details of that, I don't know. I can listen to Julie and she can present something and I can say, okay, let's make a plan about how to go forward. But I am definitely looking for other people's advice on that kind of information. And I found her presentation easy to read, easy to think about, and most helpful in answering that question.
That's a good, excellent point, Joan. Yeah. Liz, do you have any variables or points of data that you like that you focus on when you're making any of these kind of decisions or deciding on a planning course of action?
Well, if we were working in the office, which we're not really, I would get up and go ask Sherry Casso what data and I should use and ask for her guidance on how best to use it. But I would just say that science and data and research is what we have to base our decisions on if we want to do things right.
Oh, that's a good point. Joan, you got your hand
I do. I would like to know whether it's cricket for me to ask Liz a follow-up on this, because it occurs to me that while what Julie's talking about is sort of the chemical details and very sort of measurable things, and I'm wondering when you're looking at a pond with a salt marsh fringe, whether the amount of salt marsh is of a kind of factor that's relevant to you. And if I may, I'd like to ask you another question. And can you hasten the migration of salt marsh? Is that, I mean, it seems like that might be a good thing. I just don't know whether you can do it.
I don't know if anyone else has an answer to that. I don't know of any way you can hasten it. I know you can build, you can establish more salt marsh, but I don't know about hastening its migration. And I don't think I have an answer to your first question. I might defer to Bill on the salt marsh question though.
Yeah, in terms, Bill, if you're looking for data on a pond, how relevant is the extent of salt marsh to you as an indicator of pond health?
Yeah, the salt marsh, as I think was pointed out, is vital to the base of the food chain. And so it's a keystone element of coastal waters that determines the health and viability of the animals that live in the system. In addition to that, it removes silt and very fine-grained material that would otherwise accumulate in the bottom water and degrade the quality of the habitat there. So the aerial extent of the marsh, I think, plays an important role in processing nutrients in the system, and I think it's probably a secondary indicator of the health of the pond. It's important.
Thanks.
That's good.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I also want to emphasize that habitats like marshes and wetlands and submerged aquatic vegetation like eelgrass beds are crucially important because they are what's called blue carbon habitats. Liz touched on this in her talk, but they store an enormous amount of carbon in the sediments. So this carbon is captured underground and it stays there for a really long time, centuries even. And when that habitat is lost, that carbon then gets emitted back into the atmosphere, and that can cause further climate change. So that's just another reason why it's so important to protect these ecosystems, not just because they're important biologically, but they can also be a tool to help fight climate change because of all the carbon that's stored in the sediment.
Yeah, it's almost as if, with these actual habitats, you're getting so much more for your money, that they almost specialize in combating the effects of climate change specifically. And that's actually a perfect layup. Thank you, Julie, for my next question. And I'm going to direct this one to both Liz and Bill, but anyone can feel free to chime in. We've seen that those priority habitats, like the salt marsh, like the dune grass, like the eelgrass meadows, they can be the first and last line of defense for many of the threats posed by climate change. And in particular, those blue carbon habitats like the eelgrass beds they're critical for that carbon sequestration factor. And what are some ways that we as managers and maybe as the island community as a whole, what are some ways that we can help to promote and protect these areas as a strategy for combating climate change? And Bill, do you want to go first?
Yeah, certainly. Eelgrass, I think there are probably two things that we should consider. One is the cessation of dragging for scallops in the eelgrass beds once the scallop population gets down below a reasonable limit. Just going around and around mowing the grass in the pond is probably not good for the eelgrass. The other aspect of it is that eelgrass, once the water temperature gets up near 80, it's stressed. And I think we already see that in the great ponds. We get water temperatures up near 80 fairly consistently in July and August. And the one thing that we can do to try to reduce the water temperature is to open the pond and flush out the warm water that's been residing there and bring in Atlantic Ocean water. I think we're seeing the benefits of regular openings in Edgartown Great Pond in the eelgrass sort of revival. It wasn't there in the 1990s when I was working on the pond, and it's back pretty good now.
No, I think a lot of that is thanks to you, Bill, and all the hard work you put in. Is the your name is on just about every report I've come across.
Just the data guy.
We need more. Liz, do you want to follow up with that same question?
Well, I think Bill had some great comments, and I think I touched on it a bit in my presentation. Two quick things though. I think community awareness of the value of the marshes and dunes and beaches and eelgrass is so critical. And I think it's a real challenge these days to engage the public in this kind of education, because there are so many outlets these days. You know, it used to be there'd be an article in the newspaper and everyone would read it, but now we've got social media and so many other places that it's hard to know where to turn when you want to get information out to the public. And that's it's not really an answer to your question, but I think it touches on the issues. And just one other, probably also unrelated point. I found myself saying a lot in the presentation, the word that this is important to our economy. And, you know, the ponds and I think, you know, sometimes when it comes to, you know, sometimes people will perk up when you talk about the economy and their living, the way they live and the way they earn their living. And it's just another perspective we should take. It's the value of these to our local economy.
Definitely. It's just all a very good point. I've got a question here directed straight to Bill from Michael Shallett, and he wants to know, how important is dredging for good health in the Great Ponds, and particularly Edgartown Great Pond?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of the return of the eelgrass to Edgartown Great Pond is the dredge program, which cuts the channel through the flood tidal delta, the flats that form inside the barrier beach. And so, yeah, I do. I mean, it's logical. When the pond gets open and the water level drops, if there's a weak branching channel that the water can get out of the pond, can cross the tidal flats and get out of the pond, there's going to be a lot more friction and a lot reduction in the amount of water that can come and go. Whereas if you have a channel cut through the flats, it seems clear to me that there's less friction and better exchange. And the other part of the return of the eelgrass, I think, to Edgartown Great Pond is the regular opening of the pond that was overseen by Paul Bagnall, Town Shellfish.
Yeah, no, that's great. Julie, look like you have a point.
Yeah, I want to also say that another factor is that the Edgartown wastewater treatment facility was upgraded to tertiary treatment, which reduces the amount of nitrogen in their effluent. And that certainly had an impact, and I'm sure helped eelgrass beds recover. And also in terms of the dredging and the openings, we certainly see that in our data that we collect, where in years that there are dredging, the strength and duration of the openings are stronger, so they stay open longer, and we can see that salinity get flushed up more in the coves. So the coves of Edgartown Great Pond often see like a reduction in salinity because of the groundwater when the pond is open to the ocean. However, if the opening is long enough, we will see that salt water flow up into those coves, and that is an indicator that the cut was successful and the water flushed the whole pond, because we really want to reduce the nutrients and flush the pond out.
No, that's very important. And that also kind of speaks to what Liz mentioned in her presentation about maybe an island-wide dredge plan. because it does seem like, as Bill mentioned, that that reduction of friction, that improved flow in the time of a flush is what aids the pond the most, and the stability of those habitats that we were focusing on, these priority habitats. Julie, while I've got you on the line, I never asked you the follow-up question about types of data that the managers find useful. You, as a monitor and as a scientist, is there a set of variables that you find the most useful in describing the health of the pond when you're out there observing it, or for determining the effects of management decisions such as the openings?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to just choose one or two. I think you kind of have to look at it more holistically and look at all the tools that we have at our disposal. With that said, I think that dissolved oxygen is so crucial. Without oxygen, obviously, then the ponds could become dead zones. You could see fish kills. So that is a really easy indicator of impairment. Same with nutrient levels. So we have to monitor them because the ponds are suffering from increased nutrients. That doesn't necessarily, that doesn't inform short-term cut dynamics, but in terms of long-term management, such as putting in permeable reactive barriers or advocating for more sewer systems or innovative alternative septic systems, having nutrient data and knowing if there are hot spots of nutrients flowing into the pond, that's really helpful. Salinity is, as I mentioned, helpful for looking at cuts and whether or not, for eelgrass, prefers saltier water. If you're talking about managing for other biological species like the crabs or the herring, they have different requirements. Long-term though, I think just something as simple as temperature is important to monitor, because if you're trying to detect climate change, I think temperature is really, it's crucial.
And again, it's with climate change, it's such a long-term thing. It's not something you just observe on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily. And so having that consistent recording of all these variables is so extremely important.
Yeah, definitely. Because with coastal ecosystems, these variables, they change daily. Like when the sun goes up and when the sun goes down, these parameters change. And then there's seasonal trends, and you really have to have many years of the data set to detect a long-term trend.
Does anybody have anything on that?
I would add that, the salinity for the great ponds, in deciding when to make the cut, the salinity is quick and easy way to determine it. And when we were only sampling the great ponds maybe 4 or 5 times a year, the shellfish wardens, I think, would use that salinity as a factor in deciding when it was time to make the cut. And of course, the elevation of the water in the pond, it has to be up to a certain height above sea level to get that good initial cut through the beach.
Right.
I might just comment on that. One of the problems with that, I can only speak for Chilmark Pond, is that the ponds aren't nearly as big. And as some are cut, apart from its being politically very, very fractious, you don't, because the evaporation is so intense during the hot summer, that it's very difficult to build up a hydrostatic head to ensure a good cut. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's just it's just another consideration. Evaporation is a very, very big factor, certainly on our ponds.
It might be worth trying to dredge through those tidal flats to see if you could get a better cut, just as a trial. If it doesn't help, well, so be it, but it might.
I'm hoping that the Chilmark Pond people are listening to that sort of advice, because I've got a lot of advice for them based on today. Thank you.
I think I'm gonna direct this next question to Bill. And just based on your extensive and long history with the water quality monitoring and management on the vineyard, what in your mind sticks out as priorities or goals for our future? And, or in other words, you know, if money was no object, based on all your knowledge and experience, what would you prioritize next for the health of our ponds? What would you like to see?
Yeah, good question. I would toss out the concept of the precautionary principle, which you can look up online. It basically says that where there's a threat of serious environmental degradation, we shouldn't wait around for scientific certainty before we take action. And so I would, with that in mind, I would say that reduction of nitrogen from wastewater is, as Julie pointed out in the case of the Edgartown treatment plant, it's an important factor. The septic system wastewater is probably in almost all cases, the primary source of nitrogen in the system. And nitrogen just drives the whole cycle that degrades water quality over time. I would then, for the great ponds, I would get the dredging program underway in all of the ponds that are cut open, to just remove some of those tidal flats and try to get a better channel to the location of the cut. The data collection that you guys do, I just wish that I had the budget to sample on a weekly basis back in 1995 when we started the island-wide water quality pond study. That's vital stuff. That's going to bring us to the point as close as we can get to scientific certainty about what's going on. So that's a wonderful thing. I think efforts to restore the oyster population in the ponds through adding culch to create oyster reefs is important to get the filtration services that oysters provide that remove that fine particulate stuff that will degrade water quality. Those are the main ones that come to mind. I'll check my notes.
No, that's I wish I could just hand you a pot full of money, Bill.
Yeah.
Just the end of the rainbow pot.
We're all looking for it.
Always. Does anybody else, same question, because we have an enormous amount of experience represented on this panel here. Does anybody else want to add to that? Is there anything that, you would like to see?
Well, I can hop in and say, I would love to be able to deploy more continuous data loggers. So these are little sensors that we can put out in the ponds and they continuously collect data. So Bill was mentioning that we have good temporal resolution in our data by visiting the ponds weekly, but these sensors allow us to collect data every 30 minutes, every 10 minutes, we can choose the time interval. So it's really powerful because you can capture the daily fluctuation in these parameters. And you can see how low of a dissolved oxygen gets because, when the sun is not up, when it's dark outside, the plants are not photosynthesizing, and that's when oxygen is consumed quickest. And as early as we try to wake up and get out on the pond, it's impossible to capture the minimum amount of oxygen in the pond. So having these dissolved oxygen sensors, salinity sensors, the technology exists for nutrient sensors. That's a little bit more complicated because we have brackish ecosystems, so it's harder to measure nutrients with a sensor compared to lab analysis. But if money was no issue, I would love to have sensors in every pond and also multiple sensors. As I've seen, even like deploying 2 sensors at one spot, but at different depths can tell you different stories. And that would be incredible.
I want something that costs money too. As Bill was saying, you know, it's pretty much beyond dispute that nitrogen from septic systems is like kind of the biggest problem. But it's not as if there are no solutions. There are solutions. And the problem is that some of them cost quite a bit of money. On a per household basis, they probably cost, I'm just kind of guessing here, somebody might know, but in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000 for an overlay on an existing system, and perhaps even less. And that's obviously a large expenditure for someone who already has a house whose septic system is working perfectly. And it's hard to say, well, I'm going to go and spend that money because it's going to make a difference to the pond. But the towns can take action here to further that, to not sort of inspire, but to make those upgrades possible. And certainly the town of Tisbury went through this effort several years ago, the Board of Health, and they have Board of Health regulations that require upgrades in certain circumstances. And I think that if that were done more widely, we might be able to see more rapidly changes in nitrogen concentrations in the ponds. So again, there's so many things that are doable, and sadly, they cost money.
No, it seems like it, you know, especially in the context of climate change, it's this reinforcing of the habitats that we have in the health of the ponds, the systems that already exist, may be one of the best ways that we can, you know, combat that threat. I want to ask a question here to kind of out to anybody, but maybe this should go to Liz first, seeing as this is a bit of a function of the your climate action plan, and maybe just from the experience of everyone here on the panel, the many years in the vineyard, can you explain kind of to the audience, maybe to ourselves as well, just how the various different pond management groups all coordinate and work together, or what their roles are? For example, you know, you have a riparian owners association, you have pond sewers employed by the town, commissioners who make decisions about openings for the pond, conservation commissions of each town, and then you also have the Martha's Vineyard Commission. Have you, in your experience, seen how these groups work together, and do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how we might better coordinate and work together across the island? And yeah, Liz, why don't you? Sorry to throw that one right at you, but
no, I as you said, I think you know, collaboration is going to be the key to the climate action plan, and there will be some strategies that will involve a lot of these groups working together, I would imagine. There is an organization, the Water Alliance, which maybe could be used in a way that could bring together all those various partners and possibly meet regularly and assign responsibilities and become more of a action-oriented group or a collaborative group. I mean, it's a foundation to work off anyway. It already exists. You know, I think meeting regularly, you know, with the shellfish groups and the pond associations and, you know, island-wide, because, you know, it's an island-wide issue and there's no sense in duplicating efforts. We should all be focusing on the same issues and looking to do the same type of work that we can for all the ponds.
Yeah, you know, if you'd asked this question about 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been like, oh, God, who knows? You know, nobody talks to anybody else, and it's not a question they don't want to. It's that they're tied up with their own sort of territory and the imperatives of the demands of their own pond. But what I have seen over the course of the last several years is a much greater degree of interest in other ponds activities and coordination and cooperation, and you know, which I think is fantastic. I agree with Liz that there needs to be virtually constant communication between the various groups that are involved in pond health. And the way to do that is to have some sort of central, you know what, you're going to tell me this stuff all happens already and I just don't know about it. And that's maybe true. But some sort of central database, which is accessible by everybody for inputting and for looking at and for trying to make comparisons, and frequent meetings, just to ensure that you have the same, the goal should be the same, the vision should be the same. How you might reach it with each different pond, that could be, but there's so much to be gained from working together. And I will say, I have, in the last several years, observed so much more interest in working and sharing. I think there's more to be done, but I do think it's really very key. And I guess one other thing is that, to the extent possible, there ought to be a division of responsibilities. So people that are good at one thing should probably do it for all of the ponds. People that are good at something else can do something else for all of the ponds. That's a hard concept, but I think that you'll increase efficiencies and a greater sense of common enterprise. Now, if you tell me it's already happening, I will be so happy.
I think I agree with both of you. To various degrees, it is already happening. I think we are, I'm optimistic that I think we're all moving more and more in that direction. And, as Liz mentioned, the Water Alliance is fantastic. It's this, every time I participate in one of those meetings, it's just it's very encouraging to have, we have a lot of energy here on the island, and we have such a well-informed and passionate community here on the island that cares about this stuff and is highly educated and motivated. I think the energy is here and communication is key. Does anybody else have some thoughts they want to add? Well, I think we're getting close to the end point here for our panel. Thank you all again for joining us. I may just, the last question, I may direct this to Joan for the last word, if that's all right. And this one is specific, to your role as a Martha's Vineyard Commissioner. Can you offer any advice for us or examples of how we, the island community, can balance this issue of development, or sustainable development with the health and sustainability of our ponds? Do you have any insights for us?
I might have insights, and I'm not sure that they result from my role at the commission. I sort of well, I have a lot of things to say. Climate change, I believe, if it's not already, it will become the fundamental guiding policy imperative of the commission as time passes. So I think that's kind of that's my foundational position. Many solutions will arise from all over the place, including Liz's climate action plan. But from a sort of a narrower perspective, almost looking, I won't have an intro to that. What I will say is that I believe we need to limit the nitrogen output. And I think, as I said before, we have the tools. That can be done town by town. I think perhaps there's a role for the commission to take to educate and to provide and test new solutions, which the commission has been doing aggressively over the past few years. I think we need to go so far as to prohibit residential development in the flood zone. And I don't mean allow them to build up on stilts, so that it meets the architectural requirements, but just simply say, no, they're precious. No more building there. I think that local concons, and I don't know how they all run their business very well, but perhaps we all need to take a bit of a harder line against any sort of development in the buffer zone, because it's upstream of what matters and for our ponds. And the last thing again, and this is small, but nothing small. We had the fertilizer regulations, which was an initiative, at least in part by the Martha's Vineyard Commission, but also by boards of health. And it was really great, but it is almost impossible to enforce. And so the only way that it will ever be effective is through education. Education both of landscapers, but of homeowners who don't have any idea, really, most of them, what they can and can't do and what their landscapers are and aren't doing. But education is a primary role for the Commission in every aspect of making sure that climate change doesn't overwhelm us, but teaches us to be resilient. So yeah, I think education is, panacea, but it's not a joke. It's hard to do, but it is really fundamental towards getting people to get on board and to take initiatives.
I agree. Does anybody else have anything last point they'd like to add? All right. Well, that is just about all the time we have for the workshop today. And I really just want to give an enormous thank you to all of you for spending the time to talk about your work, share your experience. Is such a valuable thing to have, these resources in our community. And I thank you so much for being here and joining us today. Special thank you to Liz for that wonderful presentation and all the enormous work you're doing. Let us know how we can help. We're very excited for everything that's going on here. And I just want to quickly remind our attendees that the recording for this workshop, it will be available online on the Great Pond Foundation's website and YouTube channel. As soon as we get it edited and posted, we're going to send an email out to everyone who attended as soon as they're available. So you can look forward to that. And if anyone from the audience has any questions about any of the stuff that we talked about today, maybe it was a question we didn't get to in the panel session, feel free to forward them to us at the Great Pond Foundation. We'll do our best to either field an answer for you or find somebody who can. We want to just stress that we're here as a resource for all of our audience. And so thank you again, everyone. It's been great chatting with you, and thanks to our audience for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening and afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Take care.